All right, Beak of the Finches. So the point of this lab was to understand directional selection, but specifically how it can ultimately lead to the concept of speciation. So many of you as freshmen may have done a similar activity where you had different beaks from different species, and you talked about how the different adaptations in different species keep you alive, but that doesn't actually show how speciation occurs. How do you go from having one species to another species? Okay? And adaptations actually exist within a single species, not just across species. So what it was, and so this was all based on real research that happened on the Galapagos Islands, was they were studying a species of the finch that Darwin made so famous. And so there were a pretty even number of beaks of different sizes. And so the island had small beaked birds, medium beaked birds, and large beaked birds. And so what you did was you just basically simulated the birds eating in various seasons. So season 1, there was hella rain. Very similar to the winter we just had, and because of all of the rain, things were very, very green, and so you should have actually noticed that over this last several months as you've gone anywhere in San Francisco, or if you've left San Francisco, you should have noticed everything is green. Well, the one thing that is going to be a result of all of the vegetation is there are going to be a ridiculous amount of insects around spring and summer. So be aware of spiders getting into your house. Literally, insects are going to be everywhere this summer, which is a really good thing if you're a bird, right? And so that was what happened. There were tons of seeds, there was tons of vegetation for them to eat, and then because of it, there was lots of worms, lots of snails, lots of bugs that were there. And so they ate, they had tons of food, and so by the end of the season, even though the various beaks were competing with each other for these available resources, because there had been so much rain, there was so much food available. So we did same thing for year 2. There was a very healthy amount of rain, there was a very healthy amount of food. But what ended up happening was, and they really did get lucky with their research if you want to think about birds dying in front of you that you had formed a relationship with for 2 years as lucky, because there was a dramatic environmental change. And so one of the other concepts that this lab is meant to teach is that evolution selection happens at big bursts at a time. It's only when there is some sort of catastrophic environmental event that leads to major changes in populations. And so that's why, the volcanoes and meteors and all these things that you've heard about, like why the dinosaurs died, because it had to be something that would actually cause such a catastrophic difference, such a major change in life, because we know life is dynamic and can respond to minor changes, but when there's a big enough change, then it can really cause effects. So basically what ended up happening in year 3 is there was no food, right? And so when you say there was no food, there was a tiny bit of food, but basically, the small beak already died, fell off the table or something. Oh, it got hidden with the food. So anyway, so it got a little bit to eat, but not enough to keep it alive, right? So imagine they ate it, so they starved to death, and they watched it starve to death. Well, what ended up happening was the beaks that were big, stop rolling, the beaks that were big had able to take a type of seed that had never been actually witnessed and had never been eaten before, but they had enough force that they would work at them, and actually cause it to crack, and so then they were able to get just enough to survive. And so what ended up happening at the end of the 3rd year was every single beak that was small had died, every single beak that was medium had died, and the only beak that was left were the large beaks. And so in a single season, there was such a dramatic directional selection event that all medium and so just the large ones had existed. One thing I forgot to mention before, one thing that does play out in most of the animal kingdom, not so much humans, is the amount of food that you eat is directly tied to the amount of offspring that you have. So these were actually able to have no offspring. They were enough to survive, but they didn't have enough nutrition to survive. But year 1 and year 2, the birds that were able to eat enough, the more you eat, the more offspring you can have. So anyways, so there it is. There is an example. And and the final thing is, and so the idea is, even though we have never actually witnessed speciation in the wild, what we can imagine is if this happened enough times, you keep changing the genes enough, and so this version of finch would actually potentially become a different species than other finches in other parts of the world that didn't have this event because they actually got enough rain. There was other parts of the Galapagos Islands, there was other islands that actually did get enough rain. It was just this island in particular that didn't. So, all right, thank you for listening and good luck on the AP exam. I'm going to have to do quite a bit of editing.